Steve Delamorter here with Dr. Ralph Lee, and we'd like to walk through one of our most interesting and important data sets from the project. It has to do with ETH1 minority variants and what happens to them in the ETH2 period. And this data is all related to the book of Hosea. We've learned in previous videos about what dendrograms can tell us, and we won't do the whole thing here, but just to refresh some of the really cool things. Dendrograms give us the idea of the big movements in the textual history. So, for instance, the degree of uniformity in the tradition. In this dendrogram, the most important information is not all this stuff down here, but all this white space up here, up to the top, because that tells us that 85% of the tradition, for the vast majority of the manuscripts, all of their columns are 85% uniform in terms of shared root. That means that then the degree of difference is played out in the final 15%. And so it gives a perspective about the ratio of uniformity to difference in the tradition generally.
Beyond that, we see, if you like, the great divide in the middle between the older ETH1 period and the younger, more recent ETH2 period. And we see how the manuscripts in each of these cases are broken down into clusters. And we're interested in trying to understand why the groups are clustered together, why there's difference within the clusters, and we can't necessarily find that information in front of our faces here. So we see on this dendrogram what we've called another recension, here labeled the Lat V because it's been identified as having a Latin forelage. And we've called it another recension just because of the large degree of difference between it and the main body of manuscripts. Here it's about 45% difference rather than the 15% that we see on the rest of the dendrogram.
What a dendrogram can't tell us is why we have all these micro variations in the position of the manuscripts in the dendrogram. Why are these two exactly this different distance apart, and these two kind of subclusters related in exactly the way are, and the manuscripts within each of the clusters and on over here? What are the mechanisms that account for these smaller scale variations in the tradition? And the good news is we think we can describe now the two primary forces that differentiate the manuscripts from one another on the dendrogram and in reality. And these are minority variants in the 14th to the 16th century and what happens to them in the 17th to the 21st centuries. If you know that story right there, which is what this video is about and this spreadsheet is about, you know one of the most important things to know to understand what's going on in the textual history. The other one has to do with new readings of the 17th century, which will be taken up in the subsequent video. So what we did was construct a database. Here's the live version of it that's actually on our Google Sheets. And we went through every verse in our sample and identified, in this case, about 44, I think it is, examples of minority variants. That is a minority in this ETH1 period. And the manuscripts that have those minority variants. And so this gives us a very precise a set of information. Dr. Lee, walk us through the details of this spreadsheet.
Yeah, okay. So on the left-hand three columns, we've got just basic data so that if something's taken out of context, we still know exactly where it came from. The book, in this case, Hosea, TVU is the column number, and then the verse part. Then we have the clusters labeled with their witness numbers and their manuscript IDs and date so that we can find information about these particular manuscripts from our databases. And finally, the description of minority variants. So the text, written very carefully to identify the text of the variant, the minority variant that we've identified in the first place, compared with the text that's the majority text in the EA period. And then we have our matrix of dots that show the precise locations of the minority variant within a cluster, within a time period, and also how that minority variant is taken up or not in the later period.
We might also add that it's precisely this column here where the philological information gets introduced into all this sort of statistical analysis. This is ground zero for understanding the details and the linguistic phenomena that are at work in the tradition. Excellent. So now we ask ourselves, what does this teach us about textual history, or how does this contribute to our understanding of what's going on? In the early period, the differentiation between EA1 and EA2 is very important to us because we've come to see that these two subclusters, they occur in almost every book we look at, and they appear to be the closest to the center of the tradition. And sometimes EA1 seems to contain a few of the better readings, and other times it's EA2. But never is it completely always that EA1 contains all the best readings and EA2 doesn't. So understanding what it is that differentiates these two from one another. And again, what we've discovered is that this phenomenon we've just been looking at is one of the key, maybe the key differentiator between what's going on in the EA1 and the EA2 subclusters. It's the difference with which they bear witness to minority variants of the ETH1 period.
In addition, there's a particular group of manuscripts that need a description. They'll actually be described in more detail in the subsequent video, because whilst these manuscripts in cluster EA4 have a text type that's close to the earliest attested form, their dates tell us that they are copied in the later period, in the 17th century or later. And these form a particularly interesting group of manuscripts where we can't identify minority variants as originating from them simply because of the date. They don't exist in the earlier period, but they do tell us something very special about the later period.
Yeah. So what does this teach us about textual history? Second part of that question is it bears witness to, it documents the tremendous ferment that's going on in the 17th century. As we look at the extant manuscript tradition, the dendrogram shows very clearly there's some big thing that happens in the 16th century. The text form that exists up to the 16th century is one thing, and then it's 15% different after the 17th century, the 17th century and following. So, and then when it's happening in the 17th century itself, so that's all of these except for the Lat V, all the ones that say stand 1, stand 2, stand 3, stand 4, they're bearing witness to this new emerging standardized text, but it shows that there's tremendous ferment going on about exactly what that ought to look like. So that's a really, really interesting finding of the project. So finally, learning about the agenda and those that standardized the text in the 17th century is just a fascinating thing. And this provides firsthand data and information about that process. Dr. Lee, what else can you tell us about the modern Textus Receptus in this context?
Yeah, I suppose one of the interesting insights we get from this and some of the other data that we'll see in the next video is how does MTR relate to that standardizing process? And if you like, we can see reading from those dots that are found in the standardizing clusters and in MTR, that really MTR is the sort of fulfillment of that standardizing process. It's not a new initiative. It's something that draws very strongly on that process and makes some small changes that we'll talk about next time.
Yeah, so this video is really an invitation to you to enter into that data, look it over, come to understand it, draw your own conclusions about what it means. But we found this to be one of the most significant data sets we have.